Now, a lot of you know that I've done a lot of things with the calendar over the years. I've dedicated a major portion of my life to studying the ancient Hebrew calendar. And here we have tombstones from the southern end of the Dead Sea from a place called Soar or Zoar. Soar was one of the cities related to Sodom. There was Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Soim, and Bela. And we're told that Bela wasn't destroyed because it was small. And so it was renamed Soa, which means tinyville, small town. And Soar continued to exist. And there were Jews living in Soar in the 4th century and the 5th century and the 6th century CE. And they left these tombstones. And what's so interesting about the tombstones is they mention calendrical things. Specifically, they mention the sabbatical cycle. So, for example, this one here in the middle, it says, "This is the tombstone of the son of Megalos who died on Shabbat, the 25th day of the month of Tevet." Tevet is the 10th month. "In the first year of the sabbatical cycle, in the year 386, after the destruction of the temple piece." And this is very exciting because we don't know when the sabbatical cycle is today. And in theory, you can take these tombstones and you can say, wait, we know when the temple was destroyed. And it tells me how many years since the destruction of the temple. And it tells me what year it is the sabbatical cycle. We can figure out when the sabbatical cycle is. And people have been working on this for years. And there's some problems. It's not so straightforward. There are over 20 of these tombstones. Some of them aren't from Soar. There's one from Lebanon, for example. And they don't exactly line up as far as the best of my understanding. I did a podcast about it, if I'm not mistaken. I studied these in depth, and I couldn't get a clear answer of when the sabbatical cycle is, but maybe there's people smarter than me who can figure this out. There are certainly people who think they're smarter than me who think they can figure it out, and maybe they're right. But I want to look at all the evidence and see it line up. What is interesting is it doesn't seem that the current tradition of when the sabbatical cycle is the same as what we find in these tombstones. Now, where do we get that tradition of the current sabbatical cycle? Maimonides talks about how we don't know when the sabbatical cycle is, and there's all these different theories. And one of the problems is, when was the temple destroyed? Everyone knows it was destroyed in the year 70. But if you look at Jewish documents, they'll say year such and such of the destruction of the temple, and you trace those back, and the Jews at least believe the temple was destroyed in the year 68 or possibly 69. This is where things aren't clear. So Maimonides comes along and says, yeah, we have all these different theories, but we have a tradition from the land of Israel, and that's what we have to stick with. Well, here's a tradition from the land of Israel that predates Maimonides by 700, 800, 900 years, and it's not the same tradition. So when's the sabbatical cycle, the true time of the sabbatical cycle? That's still an open question for me. So here we have a section of the Israel Museum with some very interesting mosaics from the Byzantine period, meaning the period after the Romans became Christians. The Byzantines didn't know they were Byzantines, they just called themselves Romans. But from the year 325, we refer to them today as Byzantines. And here we have a mosaic where David is playing a harp, and it says David in Hebrew. And over here we have an incredible mosaic. And this mosaic talks about the sabbatical year. So it talks about the borders of the land of Israel for the purpose of determining the sabbatical year. And what does that mean? So the rabbis were always looking for loopholes. And if they could say that a certain area, a certain corner of a field wasn't actually part of Israel, yeah, it's part of Israel, but not for the purposes of the sabbatical year because it had been ruled by Greeks or something, they would apply that to get people exemptions. And this is a whole list of exemptions. So what's interesting to me is it's written in Hebrew. It was at the entrance of a synagogue, and it gives the borders of where these certain sabbatical rules have to be observed. And so it was something very practical for farmers who would come to the synagogue who would say, oh, I don't want to observe that. And the rabbis have now given me an exemption. And every time I walk into the synagogue, I get that exemption. And so this is probably the most popular synagogue in the region, because if you were subject to that exemption, you wanted to belong to this synagogue. So you could plant your fields even during the sabbatical cycle and benefit from the produce. So what's really interesting here for me is it lists all these different crops. And these are things that you might not know grew in the land of Israel. So in the Torah, we've got the 7 species, right? Which is the 7 biggest crops of ancient Israel. But here you have all kinds of different crops. It mentions the cucumbers and the watermelons and the melons and the carrots and the mint, which is tied by itself, the Egyptian broad beans, which are tied with shavings, and the leeks, from the festival, Sukkot until Hanukkah, and the seeds and the fennel and the sesame and the mustard and the rice. Who knew there was rice in ancient Israel? And you wouldn't know that from the Tanakh. The Tanakh doesn't mention rice, right? It mentions wheat and it mentions barley, and goes on, the garlic and the locally grown onions. So we have all kinds of different crops that we can hear about. And this tells us what was the produce of ancient Israel. What did they grow, at least in the period of Byzantine period when this was written.